Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's explainer. We are looking at a really fascinating and honestly highly opinionated sociological lecture about South Korea's current societal stagnation. It's a provocative perspective on the ideological rifts tearing through the country. Now, our goal here isn't to take sides, not at all. We're just here to impartially break down the speaker's exact arguments so we can map out this specific worldview. It's heavy stuff, you know? But looking at it through this structured lens, it's going to give us some incredible insight into how these intense divides are actually framed. So to make sense of this massive lecture, here's our roadmap. We're going to look at 1. The wasted energy of youth. 2. The unending ideological war. 3. Communism versus the party system. 4. Views on progressives and unions. 5. A critique of the cultural sector. And finally, number 6, Korea's future leading humanity. Starting right off with Section 1, the wasted energy of youth, the root of lethargy. The source actually kicks things off by pointing out a profound, immediate societal problem. And they pose a really critical question. Why are Korea's youth, who, by the way, have some of the highest education levels and potential in the entire world, suffering from such extreme lethargy and a total sense of emptiness? Well, according to the speaker, this massive pool of intellectual energy is just being thrown away on meaningless competition and aimless wandering. And the root cause? A complete and total lack of national direction. The argument here is that the state has basically failed to build a vision that actually utilizes this young energy for the greater good. Instead, the state apparatus is just, treading water, working to sustain its own jobs. Moving on to Section 2, the unending ideological war, a battle of systems. So the crucial point here is that this lecture doesn't just blame bureaucratic inefficiency for the stagnation. Oh no, it argues this is the direct result of a hidden, ongoing war. The speaker insists the Korean War never actually ended, it just changed its outfit. They draw a really stark contrast. On one side, you've got liberal democracy, the intended foundational path of South Korea. But on the flip side, the claimed reality is this opposing ideological infiltration. The lecture argues that instead of using literal bullets, this war is fought through ideological subversion. Basically, forces that are totally anti-liberal democracy have quietly dug their roots deep into the state's infrastructure, just biding their time. And to put a number on this threat, the speaker drops a massive, bold claim. They state that over 70%, 70% of state positions are now held by individuals who have actively pushed out true patriots. According to the source, these bureaucrats are basically living off taxpayer money while secretly harboring ideologies meant to tear down the nation's democratic foundation. It's a super dramatic framing, right? It paints the government not as a public service, but as this compromised machine gearing up for an ideological takeover. Which brings us to Section 3, Communism versus the party system, redefining the threat. Now, to really grasp who the speaker thinks is taking over, we have to look at how they define the threat itself. And they do this by completely redefining some major political terms. The speaker draws a hard line between communism and the Communist Party system. They argue that true communism, that utopian ideal where everyone is equal and wealth is perfectly shared, well, that's completely dead. It doesn't exist anywhere. Not in North Korea, not in China, nowhere. What actually survives is just the Communist Party system. The lecture defines this as a surviving dictatorial structure. It's basically an empty shell of the original ideology, used entirely as a tool for the party to force compliance, exert control, and ruthlessly exploit the masses for its own gain. And this brilliantly illustrates how the speaker views the economics of this dictatorial system. They break it down into this incredibly stark hierarchy. At the very top, you have just 1 to 3% of people. These are the elites. The lecture claims they hoard immense wealth, eat luxury foods like shark caviar, and secretly stash money abroad. Because, hey, even they know their system is flawed. Right below them, making up about 27 to 30%, are the loyal party members who enforce the rules. They get kept in line with rations and perks, like meat soup. Pretty huge step down from caviar, right? And then at the very bottom, you have the remaining 70%, the masses, entirely exploited and left to starve. The speaker's point? This exact exploitative structure is what those infiltrators in South Korea are secretly trying to set up. Let's look at Section 4, Views on Progressives and Unions, the Shell of Democracy. Next, the lecture takes this framework and points it directly at modern South Korean society, specifically labor unions and left-wing politics. The source takes a highly polarized stance here. They argue that words like democratic and progressive have been totally hijacked. They contrast true progress, which is, genuinely moving a society forward, with the modern progressive label used by major labor unions today. According to the speaker, these unions toss around the word democratic as a deceptive package. It's just a shell used to manipulate the public into backing tactics that are actually straight out of the Communist Party playbook, all about control and disruption. To explain how this political opposition even formed, the lecture dives into a specific historical narrative about past protest movements. The speaker claims that back in the day, protesters were basically pushed right out of the workforce by the state. Now, the highly capable, intelligent dissidents, they managed to move abroad to places like the US or France, but legally they were blocked from ever coming back. The tragic irony here, at least according to the speaker, is that the folks who were left behind in South Korea fell into absolute poverty. And out of that deep economic struggle, they morphed into this hypercritical, disgruntled faction, a group that aligns with opposition politics not out of some pure ideology, but simply out of hardship and societal resentment. All right, Section 5, Critique of the Cultural Sector, the Taxpayer Dilemma. The explainer now takes this really fascinating turn from macro-level politics down to a super micro-level critique. The lecture takes a surprisingly harsh stance on the cultural sector. They estimate that less than 3% of artists are actually self-sustaining. The speaker paints the rest of these cultural workers as living in deep, deep self-absorption. Instead of treating their art like a growing business or actually giving back to society, the source claims they just relentlessly complain about their environment. And worse, that they constantly demand taxpayer money and state subsidies to just fund their lifestyles. To really hammer this point home, the speaker uses this highly specific, colorful anecdote. Picture this: struggling artists sitting in their studios, drinking makgeolli, smoking, and arrogantly telling anyone who dares to question their lack of commercial success to just shut up and don't interfere. The source argues that these folks rely entirely on their families for money, literally draining their relatives until the whole family goes bankrupt, all while keeping up this arrogant, aloof attitude that is just completely disconnected from reality. Finally, Section 6, Korea's Future Leading Humanity, the Ultimate Destiny. Let's move to and see how this builds to the speaker's ultimate conclusion. Because wow, despite all this incredibly heavy criticism of the state, the youth, the unions, and the artists, the lecture suddenly pivots to grand optimism. The speaker makes this firm, overarching declaration. South Korea is a nation destined to lead humanity in the future. They totally reframe all the societal chaos, the hidden ideological wars, and the cultural stagnation we just talked about. It's not a sign of doom. Nope. It is a painful but absolutely necessary learning phase. The idea is that the country is going through these intense contradictions for one reason. It is being prepared for a massive global role. So how do they get there? The lecture lays out a strict 3-step path for the Korean people. First, they have to stop being bystanders. They need to openly acknowledge this deep, hidden ideological divide. Second, they must actively study the roots of this systemic chaos, like really dig in and understand exactly why these societal failures are happening. And third, by learning from all this internal turmoil, South Korea will finally overcome its contradictions, unlocking its true destiny to lead the rest of the world. Which brings us to a really compelling final thought. The sources painted a picture of an incredibly divided nation. A place where the government, labor unions, artists, and political parties are all locked in this quiet, brutal ideological war. Yet it also claims this exact pressure cooker is what will forge a global leader. So the big question we have to walk away with today is this: how can a society that is so deeply fractured by such intense ideological warfare ever manage to bridge those extreme gaps, unite its people, and actually achieve that grand global potential? It's a fascinating paradox, right? And it perfectly wraps up the complex worldview presented in this material. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. And remember, keep questioning the structures around you.